To support this show, go to patreon.com/5G4D. Out of the street corners they scream. You knew it was coming. You've been waiting for this for months. Rumour hardened into fear and now they scream at you. The sirens, their hysterical wail tearing through the white noise of the city. And you run. You run to pick up those things that can never be replaced. A picture of them in the days when they still loved you. Your mother's wedding ring. And then you turn to your shelf of games. You only have room for 5. 5 games for Doomsday. 5 Games for Doomsday is a show in which board game personalities are thrust into a cabin in the woods to outrun an oncoming disaster, but can only take 5 of their games with them. But which will they choose? My guest this week is an educator, performer, and inexplicably, for a man of such erudition, comic book devotee. He has moulded the minds of undergraduates while simultaneously being a stand-up comic and podcaster. His commentary on board games is the high watermark for those who wish to treat games as something other than toys. He is the board game professor, Nick Mariner.
Hello.
So, just to start, this is what I usually sort of speak to people about when I start the show. How difficult was it for you to pick the games?
It was very difficult. I probably would have an easier time choosing which of my children to save, in the apocalypse. The girl would be my answer on that one. Well, that's an easy one.
And what was the criteria that you used?
That's a great question. I started out, because I really found myself getting deep into the scenario you've created here. And so the idea I started to think about was it's Doomsday, which means probably everything has gone to shit pretty thoroughly. And so these are the 5 games I have left, so at first I started the system of like, well, what has the most variability? Which has the most replayability? What could I really hold on to forever and not get sick of playing? And I went through all of those for a while, but as I started to think about the question, I realized, there's a central assumption in the question, that's sort of going unchallenged, which is, that you should have board games at all in Doomsday. And so I started to ask myself, what would even be the point of having board games after the apocalypse? It's a post-apocalyptic every Mad Max movie you've ever seen. What would even be the purpose of having games around? And I think that what I came to think about was the role board games play in my own life, because I realized I never once questioned that assumption. It never once seemed to me silly, the idea that I would want board games around. And I started to think, for me, one of the roles board games play in my own life, it's a centering practice. It's comfort. I feel when I'm at the table and I'm playing a game, and if it's a really good game in particular, I feel whole. I feel, honed in, mindful, aware of what I'm doing. And I feel like everything about what I've got going on is right where it's supposed to be. And there's very few other places in my life where that's true. And so as I was going through my collection, I looked at my shelf and not almost literally, but not quite, put my hands on almost every box I owned and thought to myself, if everything had gone to hell and this is all I've got left, would this game be something that brought me comfort? When everything else probably would be a disaster. So I didn't want anything that was like hard and complicated. Like in Doomsday, in the apocalypse, I'm probably going to spend most of my time like, siphoning gas out of cars and fighting rival gangs and trying to, and harvest my own food. Like, I don't want to come home and play Brass or Le Havre, because they're hard. That would feel like work. So I started to think about games that would, I could imagine wanting to come to in the worst imaginable circumstances, in order to find some solace and comfort and serenity, when when that's what I would need them for. So that was really my thought process and how I got to the 5 games that I picked.
So how do you think you'd fare in this post-apocalyptic world? And is it inevitable that we become savage?
I'll answer the first question, the second question first, which is, yeah, probably. Like, if you've ever been sort of like, in a coffee shop when the Wi-Fi goes out, like, that's all you need, an indication of humanity for what we will do the moment we become even remotely inconvenienced and how we will treat one another. I have to think if we lose access to like the basic necessities of life and creature comforts, we'll go, full Lord of the Flies, like almost immediately, I would think. And how would I fare is, I'd be fucking dead in a heartbeat. I probably would hold myself up with my kids if God willing, they get to be around for that also. And, we would just draw straws for who gets to eat each other. Like that's pretty much the way we would fare.
And who do you think would taste the best?
Oh, the girl. The boy's 15. He smells terrible. He's almost 15. He takes these like 45-minute long masturbation showers. Like he's had his run. All right. He's the first to go. That's a no-brainer.
So let's go back to the beginning. What was your first contact with gaming? What sort of gaming did you do as a younger person?
When I was a kid, we were latchkey kids. You have that expression over there, like a latchkey kid?
Yeah.
My parents worked full time. And especially over the summer, they would go to work, and my sister, who's just a couple of years older than me, but she eventually got old enough to be the official babysitter. We had our games stocked, our game shelf stocked, and it was a lot of the mass market stuff, but we would also go to my grandmother's house often so she could watch us. And she had a really interesting game collection for like an old, I think it was probably like my uncle who lived with her sometimes brought some of these games in. But that was probably my first exposure to some of the unique stuff that most people didn't grow up playing, something a little, more interesting than the Sorries and the Monopolies and stuff. And, like for instance, her house was the first place I played Scotland Yard. That she had a copy of Scotland Yard, and I actually found the same edition that she had in her house growing up at like a used bookstore a few years ago and bought it, and it's still on my shelf. And it never gets played, but it's almost just a memento of it, more than anything. But we would play Scotland Yard. And then we had games that were, I don't think it was Talisman, but it was Talisman-like. We had these games that were sort of dungeon type games and fantasy settings, and we'd play through those, and we'd play with the miniatures. We had an X-Men game that I see every time I go to BGG Con on the shelf, and I want to pull it out and see what the actual rules were, because we would just play with like the plastic miniatures, and I had no idea what we were doing because we were like 9. But that was sort of the first gaming. And then we also had like, I still so fondly remember, you remember those games that had a VHS tape integrated into the play where you'd put the cassette in and play it. And we had one of those. It was called Atmosphere. And it's the dumbest game in the world. But I would so love to play that again. And I looked it up, and you can get it as a DVD. And I don't want the DVD. I want the VHS. And I realized like $80 for that, plus however much it would take for me to also find an apparatus to play that VHS at this point would be, it's not worth the time, not worth the investment. So those are sort of my earliest memories of playing board games.
But in the notes you sent me, you said that you had something of a hiatus from gaming and only picked it up relatively recently. So why, and what were those first few sort of hobby games that people like us would recognize? Sure.
I've been thinking a lot about it, and I'm not entirely certain if I have a great answer for the why. Like, why did this happen? Why did I step away? Like, we always played games still. Like I remember in high school, we wanted a copy of Monopoly, and we went to, Walmart, and they didn't have the base copy, so we got a copy of Pokemon Monopoly and like played the hell out of Pokemon Monopoly every weekend. So it wasn't an idea like I just stopped playing games entirely, but I think I just hit an age where I'm buying into the same shit that everybody buys into, which is games are a childhood frivolity. It's really funny. Last night I watched Tucker and Dale versus Evil, which is an absolutely amazing horror comedy. And there's a moment in there, he's stuck in a cabin out in the middle of the woods with this girl, and there's a moment where he pulls some board games off the shelf and he talks about how much he likes board games, but it reminded me that for most people, as an adult, the idea of a board game is something you do when you're at the beach and it started raining. So the house you rented had like a closet full of board games, and like you do it as a last minute desperation to fill your time whenever all other plans fell through.
A compromise activity. Yes,
exactly. Like it is a actual pastime. And that probably was what it was for me for a while. And so games turned into things like, card games that you could sit and drink beer and possibly gamble at, like spades and hearts and things like that. Euchre was huge in the Midwest. And so I just sort of didn't play or pursue much for a while. And then the thing that actually got me back in the hobby, and I'd be surprised if this isn't true for a lot of gamers, was Magic the Gathering. I was in grad school, which is, over 10 years ago now. Oh, that's depressing. Yeah, I guess about 10 years ago, I was in grad school, and I took a qualitative research class where we had to find a group of people that had some sort of like community, something that they were about, and you had to do an observation of their activities and interview a couple people involved. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. They left it super open-ended. And I was at the mall, farting around on my own time, and I walked past the mall's game shop, and there were collapsible tables set out front, and there were guys playing in a Magic the Gathering tournament. And I remember walking by and being stricken by two things. The first was the game itself. I was looking at the cards. I was fascinated by I sort of watched, having no idea what they were doing. And I watched a few hands, and the art on the cards is amazing, and I wondered what the mechanics were about. But I was also taken by the fact that they were all adults. Like, that was the main thing that caught my attention. It wasn't children, whose moms were just walking around while they dropped them off. It was grown men, almost exclusively men, playing this game, and that I had sort of attached the ideas that this is kind of the thing that you do, in high school maybe, but then you stop about the time you stop doing Dungeons and Dragons. And so I went into the shop and I bought a couple starter decks and, asked the guy a few things, and he told me there was a draft in a few days. So I went home, I learned how to play the game. I did some practice rounds, and then I went back and participated in the draft, tournament, and got my ass just handed to me. And then I interviewed a couple of the guys, and I did that all for a school report, but I turned in the paper and everything was fine. But then I continued to play the game for several years. And that was like the first hobby game, gaming activity that I had much investment in. But of course, I'm sure you know this as well. Magic, there is a steel barred gate in Magic between casual and competitive, and the key to that gate is financial. You have to pay money to get to the next level, and it got to a point where I didn't want to make that investment anymore. I was spending way too much money every month on it, and so the place where I was buying my cards had designer board games as well. And I started to sort of peek more and more over to those sections. And, I was seeing more and more games that I'd never heard of on like things like Will Wheaton's Tabletop, that was right around that time. And I think the first hobby game I bought was, Catan. That was probably the first one.
So your first game that you're going to take to the cabin with you is a kind of contemporary of Magic, and it's one of those big classic Euros that ushered in the whole sort of new wave of European gaming into America, and that's Carcassonne. Why have you chosen it, and why did Carcassonne light the spark that so many other games didn't?
That's a great question. It's funny because when I did this list, lots of stuff almost made it and didn't make it. I was surprised by some of my choices, and this one actually surprised me the most. that the more and more I thought about it, the more and more I realized how great it would be in this particular Doomsday scenario to have a copy of Carcassonne around. So for me, when I think about playing, and there's, this is not the best tile laying game. There are other tile laying games I think I like better. Cacao, for instance, I think is terrific. But that's not the exercise. The exercise isn't what are your, like, the 5 best games of every category, 5 essentials. It was what game would you like to still have around? Like, keep into it. I almost consider myself in this process like the, like an archivist almost. Somebody who is holding on to artifacts in order to maintain them for humanity. And Carcassonne strikes me as a game that I would like to know still exists. Because for me, it is a exercise in serenity. You pick up a tile and you have to do something with that tile. And you have to fit it into your own strategy and what you're doing. You have to think about what the other players at the table are doing. So it's not so light that it's, meaningless play. But at the same time, it's idyllic. Like, the art is nice. It's not violent at all. It's not even particularly, cutthroat at the table. And it is a practice in which it's serene. The game itself is serene in play. And it's precisely what meets the criteria I was describing earlier, which is, when I think about playing Carcassonne, I feel so comfortable. I feel so sated. And that's what I was looking to hang on to in a game. Now, why did it strike a chord? I'm not sure. I think it was probably just, I didn't bother to look up, and I don't remember what year it came out, but, it probably, I think, caught wider appeal because it is so simple, but also so rewarding. It never feels in a game of Carcassonne like I'm just doing nothing the entire time. But I also don't feel taxed. I feel like I can have a game, with, whoever's at the table and, as we're about to move on to something big and cumbersome and hard, we can put Carcassonne on the table and sort of enjoy ourselves for a half hour, and feel pleasantly connected at the table without any sort of exhaustion. And I would venture to say that's probably one of the first games that, people had gotten that experience from. It doesn't take 4 hours like Monopoly. You don't want to flip the fucking table over because you're bored and it's stupid and nothing's happened, or like Risk. You get a compact, enjoyable experience. Then you get to move on to the next thing. And while you have done it, you feel, you are engaged for that amount of time. And I think it probably caught, people's attention for being able to deliver that, in a way that was at the time pretty new.
Do you think people are getting sniffy about these old classic games? And do you think we ignore them at our own peril?
Yes, I do. Yes to both. I'll talk about this more with one of the other games on my list because it drives me nuts. But, everybody wants to talk about like game killers, and there's the classics, and then something else comes out and everyone says, oh, this is a Carcassonne killer. Like Cacao comes out and everyone says, I'll never play Carcassonne again. Carcassonne's dead to me. As if like they can't both exist. Because our time is at a premium. Our time is finite. So you're only going to play certain things with the time that you have. But some games, Carcassonne is definitely one, hold up on their own. They continue to be good games. And I think that all of the expansions and reprints and, you can get Carcassonne at Barnes & Noble at this point. Like, it is fairly well mass marketed. It attests to its chops, to continue to stand up in a hobby that has, stood on its shoulders and advanced past it. But that doesn't make it not worth going back to Carcassonne itself or some of these other, classic games, because they do still stand up. And there's some that don't. Like, I think there are some games that don't, hold up like they did because people have come and done something better, and now they just feel stale and maybe not as rewarding. Like the first one that comes to mind for me is Kingsburg. Like I loved Kingsburg the first time I played it, the first few times. And it was like one of my favorite games for a really long time. And then so many other games have done dice worker placement better that I don't think I'd probably, the last time my group played Kingsburg, we felt like by the end it felt merciful that the game had ended.
So moving on, you went into the humanities.
Yeah.
What has been your career path? What did you study at college, and what did you then go on to do?
So when I was in college, I had 5 majors by the end of the first semester. I had the school record for the shortest possession of a major, which was 15 minutes. I went to registration day. I wasn't sure what I wanted to major in, but I was sort of obstinate that I wasn't just going to go undeclared. Like I wanted to declare a major. So a thing that I thought sounded interesting was advertising. And so they said, that's a marketing major. And I took the papers and I went and sat down and looked at the course load and went right back to the table and said, I'm going to change my major, please. But what I ended up studying in college was the same thing that I thought, like all growing up, I wanted to do, which was history and be a history teacher. It was the class and subject that I liked the most in school since middle school for me. And I knew I wanted to teach, and I thought at the time I might coach, and I have coached track and field before, but I don't anymore. It was between English and social studies, and I picked history. So I got into history almost more specifically to become a teacher. And then as I got further and further into that major, I realized I was more and more interested in history as a discipline as opposed to teaching as a career. And so I went on and got my master's degree in history. And after that, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, and found a PhD program in educational foundations and cultural studies, which was just sort of a nice mishmash of both. It was history and philosophy and sociology, and interdisciplinary, but it was also, about teaching and education. So I went into that program and I taught history for years while I was in grad school, at the high school and community college level. But then I eventually went on and became a university faculty in education and taught teachers. Did that, and then eventually I moved to Dallas. Sort of was really tired of doing that and wanted to get back to history. So I found a high school that needed a history teacher, and it all sort of worked out. And that's what I'm doing now. Back to teaching high school history, and it's wonderful.
And so, what is the role of a teacher in the current age? Because everyone has access to all information at all times. Is your role as much of a curator as an educator now?
Well, it is an interesting question because it depends on, I guess, who you ask. Like we do have, unfortunately here in the States, our teachers have the, role of, we are test proctors, which sucks. It's the fucking worst part of the job, by far. You know, we're preparing them for these state exams. And it's sort of dumb, but, you know, I think more to your point, everyone does have access to all information at all times now. However, we don't practice a sense of what to do with that information when we find it. There is no guidebook on the internet that tells you how to safely treat, whatever stupid shit you stumble upon. You know, and so the role of the teacher isn't just to help students and facilitate how to find information, but it is to help them figure out how am I going to safely grapple with the information I'm finding. And how I can actually make sense of the world now that I can know anything there is to know about the world at any moment. You know, and that's how we get like the inability to do that is how we have, when I was a kid, there were 3 things that we did not have. We did not have the measles, we did not have Nazis, and we did not have a fear of falling off the edge of the earth. And thanks to the internet, we have all 3 of those things again. For one reason or another, because all the information is out there, and we practice finding information. We do not practice, understanding information or interpreting information. And I think that's really the role of the teacher. In today's climate isn't to just help students know things. It's to help students understand what they find.
Are you afforded the time and are you afforded the opportunity to push critical thinking, the idea of not taking things at face value, or are you sort of compelled to push through a curriculum and hit certain targets at certain times?
Yeah, it's both and really, it is a breakneck pace when it comes to the curriculum and everything there is to cover, especially like, for instance, world history. I'm teaching world history right now. I got to spend like 3 days on the, Protestant Reformation, which I think is, it cannot be overstated how substantial the Protestant Reformation is in shaping all of European history, and then eventually all of world history. And I got to talk about it for like 2.5 days. And so that sort of sucks how fast you have to move through things in order to get from, Mesopotamia to today. But at the same time, I think, there's an avenue to teach the critical thinking and the deeper thinking skills and the research skills while you go about it. You unfortunately have to go too fast through the topics, but you don't have to speed through critical thinking skills. Those can just be things you do every day. Like that is part of the practice of what we do in class today. So what the topic we're researching might change, but how to continually hone those skills of writing and thinking and argumentation, like that could just be an everyday practice. So you sort of do them both at the same time.
So your next game, you have Carcassonne, which is one of the established classics. And then although this game came out only a few years later, this one is not regarded in the same way as a sort of dusty old remnant of a previous generation. This is still as fresh and contemporary as ever it was. This is Ticket to Ride. Why have you chosen it? And I played Ticket to Ride once and was hugely underwhelmed. Explain to me why this game commands the regard it does.
Well, Ticket to Ride for me, I think I said a minute ago, I think Catan was probably the first hobby game I purchased and wanted to like, but Ticket to Ride for me was the gateway game. It was that first hit of the 8 ball that got me hooked. And the first time I played it was absolutely smitten, because of its simplicity. And I really do think, like when I said with Carcassonne, I think why it struck a chord with audiences was because you teach it to your grandmother and, over like right after lunch and on an afternoon. And Ticket to Ride is also that simple. There are like a handful of rules. I can get Ticket to Ride on the table and we're playing in less than 5 minutes. And people who would otherwise not want to play anything more complicated can feel like they grasp what they're doing and feel never at any moment in Ticket to Ride feel like, they're just completely lost. Which unfortunately that happened to me a few times when I was trying to get friends into the hobby with other games. We were playing things and it just, I tried to, play Small World with some of my comedian friends back in South Carolina. And I thought like, this is a pretty accessible game. And my one friend like described it as doing taxes in Middle Earth. That's what he said Small World feels like. Cause it was just all like too much information. Ticket to Ride is not too much information. It's all, you get it. I can give it, I can give you the 3 rules you need, in less than 5 minutes. And then we're playing a game. And so I think there's that element of it. The other element is it's got a lot of the components I like. It's got the pretty simple set collection. I love root and network building games. Almost put Power Grid on this list, but it was just almost a little too complex for the criteria I'd set. And I think I don't know. I think every game of Ticket to Ride feels satisfying to me. When I think about games that provide for me the most comfort, and the more security and safety, it's one of the first ones that comes to mind because of the role it played for me personally in roping me into this hobby and going to find deeper things. I think Ticket to Ride Europe is probably an actual better game. But that's not the exercise. And that wasn't the way I was making these decisions.
You're an academic. You go to university, you become a teacher, you teach at university and then in high school. But next to that, you take up, which is, now I'm an actor, and there is one thing that even just the thought of it chills my blood, and that's doing stand-up comedy. How did you sidle into that area?
Yeah, I don't actually fully remember. I was seeing someone at the time. I was in South Carolina. I was dating someone, and we looked up actually an improv class first. And went to do that, and it was fun, and we had a good time, and we put on a couple improv shows, and I actually ended up doing improv for quite a while as well. But the more and more I realized how fun it was to perform, the more and more I wondered if stand-up comedy was anything that I had any chops in. And I started to write out bits. I was just curious if I was any good at it at all. And I mean, the thing with stand-up is, no, you're not. No one ever is. Like, the first 5 times you go up, you're terrible. That's the whole point. But I went up, a couple times. It was going okay. And then I think probably like the 3rd or 4th time, I got a really hard laugh at a joke that I was really happy about. And it was exactly like what I just described with games. Like, it was that moment of like, this is a drug that I want to exhaust myself on.
But how do you get to, now I've done terrible performances. I've been with audiences that are very unreceptive, and, you get laughs in a certain place and they just don't laugh. And I understand that pain, but how do you do the first 3 times when it's horrendous? I mean, for me, if I did it once, then I would walk away. My self-confidence completely shattered.
Oh, there's like, it's so defeating when you think something's just absolutely hilarious and you throw it out there and it gets nothing. It just feels awful. I don't know. I used to do stand up with guys. We go to open mics every week and practice some of your material. And I would watch dudes at these open mics who'd been doing it for 10 years. This one guy had like gone up to New York and tried his hand, and he was awful. And he was terrible, and he was always terrible, and I don't think ever was any good. And he would go up every night and do the same shitty material, and it would bomb. And then he'd like pick a fight with someone sitting in the first row from stage. And it was that same question of like, what are you getting out of this? Because this is a catastrophe from where I'm sitting. So I don't know. I think it's, I tell people to try it. I always tell people to try it at least one time. Because it is, what do they say? Like more people are afraid of public speaking than they are of dying. And so for a lot of people, it seems petrifying, but I think everybody should at least give it a shot. And go up there and try it and see what happens. And, I think I had confidence going in that, okay, I'm just sort of working out the kinks, and I got to get to know like stage presence and how to hold a microphone and all those things. And it takes practice. But at the same time, I knew what I was writing down and thinking, okay, but this stuff is funny. I'm not crazy. I think these jokes are funny. I just got to get better at this. And it's like anything else. You had, Isaac on this show, and he talked about game design a little bit like that. Like, you just have to try it and be shitty at it for a little while, and after a while it'll start to click. And then when it starts to click, that's the moment you've determined for yourself, is this a thing that I'm getting any reward from, or is this not growing corn for me? That's a weird expression that I use sometimes. It grows corn for you. You know what I mean? Like, does that make sense? That's too Midwestern. Like, I grew up in the Midwest. I was surrounded by corn. So that was an expression we use, like whatever grows you corn.
It's growing sauerkraut here. So.
Oh, right. Well, we call that Liberty cabbage here.
And so what is the state of your stand-up career now?
It's funny that you ask, because it's a little bit on hiatus. I did a show over Christmas break here, and went really well. And I was talking to a guy backstage, and he was telling me like all the mics he goes to and all the places to perform and what they pay, and he's doing it 5-6 times a week. And I realized this is a thing that I still say that I do, but it's actually not a thing I think I could anymore claim I'm pursuing, if that makes sense. Like, I'm doing it when shows are available, and I go out and I get asked to do a thing, and I go out and I do some of my material. but it is taking a bit of a backseat as I get reoriented, with teaching and a new school. And that's really, in the driver's seat at this point. So comedy is just sort of more of a leisure activity as opposed to, the thing that I'm relentlessly pursuing, which I had been for a couple of years.
So your next game is discussing your sort of history in Magic. Seems to me to be a game that scratches that Magic itch. And this is Seasons. But this game is a lot more complicated than your previous games. Why is this one in the cabin?
I adore Seasons. For so many reasons. It is colorful, and that was part of it too. The art in Seasons is so wonderful. It's so bright and vibrant. And I did sort of calculate that into probably assuming everything else in the world would be dreary and disastrous. And so the idea of having something as aesthetic as Seasons was part of the decision, but you're exactly right. It did, for me, scratch the itch that Magic had given. It filled the hole and that it left behind. And for probably the first year to almost 2 years that I really was into hobby gaming, I called Seasons my favorite game. Like, Seasons was my favorite game for a really long time. And it was before I had really gotten deep down the Euro rabbit hole. But it does. I love drafting in games. I love pick and pass drafting. And that's entirely what Seasons is about. You draft the cards, you draft the dice. Every single turn is a draft. It's incredibly satisfying, that process. And it's also a lot meaner than the other two games that we've already talked about. Like, you can really be, aggressive towards your neighbors and your opponents in Seasons. But it holds all of those mechanics that I like in a game. Being able to put cards together but unlike Magic, everybody's got the same cards, so we're all playing the same game. And it's not, nobody's going to come in and purchase their way to victory. And I'm not sure really what else I want to say about it other than the fact that for a very long time, it was the game I was playing the most. It was the game I always said was my favorite game. It gave me everything that I wanted out of Magic in terms of, it's got, nature-based mana that you're paying as a resource. You're drafting cards. You're trying to put combos together to do interesting things. It was an excellent bridge between a lifestyle game like Magic and a lifestyle like hobby board gaming. And I value it for that reason. I would keep my copy before a lot of other things that I had copies of.
So I want to talk to you more broadly now about the humanities. America seems to me, far more than anywhere else sort of in the Western world, to be divided upon certain things. And there is a lot of outcry at the moment about the humanities and their role in this division. And a lot of people throwing accusations of censorship and oversensitivity and things. And university faculties, the humanities coming out and almost running mob rule over the university campus in America. To what degree do you think this is true?
Just in terms of how much we want to limit the humanities, or how dominant it's become
how dominant it's become, and also the sort of left-wing cultural Marxist idea of humanities.
I don't know. It's funny because, Neil deGrasse Tyson, the physicist, has a really popular Twitter handle. His Twitter feed is interesting, but about a month ago, he was tweeting all of these tweets about like how we should be educating children to, understand their world and critique their world, not just, take tests and things like this. And every single one of his tweets was retweeted or responded to by somebody that was a professor or educator in the humanities saying, that's what we have been doing for centuries. And it was sort of like, you're treating hard sciences as the only thing that exists. And you're forgetting that there is an entire branch of soft sciences or social sciences that do exactly what you're describing, which is figure out how culture and humanity works as an organism, not just how natural law can be measured and processed. And I think that in the last 10 years in particular, but, I don't know, I guess probably in the last couple decades, that voice has just grown a lot stronger, and louder. And I think the internet has probably helped in that. But this is where the role of the teacher comes into play. There is nothing I hate more on the internet than seeing somebody who shares my politics, but clearly hasn't done the reading. And so they're out there just sort of screaming at the top of their lungs, whatever the latest, activist craze is, of the day, the latest hashtag that people want to, attach to a movement. But you just know they're not thinking deeply about it. Like, they haven't read Marx. They haven't read, the great feminist work. They haven't talked about, or aren't aware of things like intersectionality, and, they're still holding on to, social politics that's a couple decades old, because they're not doing the reading. They want to be attached to a cause, but they're not thinking deeply about it. And so, like, my kid, my 15-year-old, he's gotten really, in the last couple months, he's gotten really into anarchism. Like, he's all about it. And he's super anti-capitalist, and he wants to replace the whole system. And, I sort of let him talk, but every time he tells me what he thinks, the first thing I do is just put a book in his hands and just say, like, here's Gramsci, here's, Machiavelli, here's, I bought him the Communist Manifesto. Like, you need to be reading, is what I keep telling him. You don't just, like, other people have already thought what you think, and you need to go read what they had to say about it. Because it's not enough to just tell everybody what you think. You need to really know, what's going on. And that's, the role that education plays. That's the role that humanities play. Having to understand Trump is, it's exhausting, because he throws so much at you all the time, but it helps to know that that's part of the strategy. That is part of the right-wing strategy, is to just give you so many things to critique. You don't know where to look. You don't know which thing to latch onto. And so that's what humanities provides us. It provides us an analysis for a time that, at least as it currently stands, is pretty fucking, confusing and horrendous and, like I said, exhausting.
What do you feel about the current trend towards deplatforming within the university system of America?
I see what you mean. It becomes a cry of free speech. And what people don't understand, at least or the way they're not talking about it, and the way our Constitution is built, is the state may not abridge your speech. So if you want to speak at the University of Texas, since the University of Texas is an organism of the state, First Amendment says that they need to give you a platform. And if they don't, then you might have a court case on your hands, and it sucks, because sometimes that platform is shitty. But if Milo, whatever the fuck his name is, shows up at the University of Texas to spout his neo-Nazi bullshit, and all of the students show up and they protest so much that he can't get on stage, that actually is not a violation of the First Amendment. Because, the state itself has given you the platform, and the people have demanded, that you shut the fuck up. And so they're exercising their right to assembly. They're exercising their free speech. And it's actually not that Milo has not been given the platform. The platform was provided, and the people have responded with their opinion on his platform.
Richard Spencer is obviously deeply, deeply problematic. Do you think that these kind of tactics exacerbate a problem of division?
Well, yes and no. I think, you're right. Richard Spencer and Milo, Yiannopoulos, or whatever his name is, they are the, extreme examples. And so that's an easy one, right? That's an easy one to be like, well, obviously you can't, say the stuff you're saying, or like, we will not allow this discourse in our modern world. But then you get down to the argument that gets thrown out then is the slippery slope argument. Well, if you can keep him from talking, and if you can just shout down whoever you want because you don't agree with him, like, how far down does that go? And I think that becomes a valid argument only up to a point. Like, I think that there is, as a society and as a culture, we are still sort of feeling it out, but we are allowed, I think, at some point to figure out where the line is of, everybody should have the right to say what they want, but at some point, hate speech is where the line is drawn. And I don't want division. I don't want to curtail speech. I don't want to, minimize oppositional thought any more than anybody else. But there is a moment where I'm comfortable saying, that speech is not welcome. That idea that you have, we're past. You talk about what history's for. Like, we've seen how that plays out already. And it's not welcome back in the conversation. So you're going to have to shut the fuck up. And let the adults move on with society like we decided to 50 years ago. So I don't know. I mean, it does sort of hasten and exacerbate division. But decrying that, sort of, it provides also a backdoor for, people to just say some really heinous shit. And it's the Karl Popper, dilemma of tolerance. Like, if you can't society can't just be tolerant, because if you have to tolerate all things, then at some point you're going to have to tolerate intolerance. And so it becomes, that's not a useful mechanism for deciding what goes. Tolerance is not.
So your next game is possibly the epitome of gentleness. And I think, seasons aside, and probably your fifth game on the list definitely aside, you've kind of gone for this games providing a gentleness and a calmness to settle over the cabin so you don't shoot each other. Why is Patchwork there?
Right. It's there precisely for what you just described. That is exactly the role Patchwork plays in my life now, especially with my daughter. My daughter's 10. She's going to be 11 in a couple months. And it is the game that we play all the time together. We have got a free evening. School's been shitty all day, or it's just we're exhausted. We want to do something before bed. We usually read a book together before bed. But if we have time to play a game, it's either Patchwork or Love Letter. And this list, it was going to be between one of those two games, Patchwork or Love Letter for me. Because that's precisely the role that they play in my actual life. They are a, decompression, moment. It's been a long day. We're tired. Let's throw something on the table that I can sit and talk to my, little girl about her day and how it went. And, we don't have to feel overwhelmed or exhausted by what we're doing. It's not necessarily even about the game itself. It's just about, the quietude of, this activity that we're sharing together. So that's why it's on the list, and that's why it continues to be an important game for me. It's a top 10 game for me, otherwise anyway. But I also think it's an absolutely smashing game design. I think it's exceptional. I think it is, there is not an ounce of fat on the game of Patchwork. The decision, you only get the 3 tiles ahead, so you can sort of calculate out for a couple moves, but not so far that it paralyzes you. The way the pieces fit together and the way you have to manipulate both time and space, on your board. It's an absolutely exquisite game. And so that is combined with the fact that it has such a deeply meaningful role in my own life that I could not imagine any game collection of mine in any circumstance not including Patchwork in it.
So coming on to your current life as a history teacher in high school, what's the value of history as a subject? This was, my friends at school would always go, why do we want to learn about these old dusty sods when we could be, I don't know, learning business or something? What's the value of history as a subject?
That's the first thing I start every history class with is that exact question. Why are we here? If we can't come up with an answer to that question, then we might as well go home. And I always say, what is the value of history? And inevitably, I don't think it's ever not happened. The first person who raises their hand says, we have to study history so we don't repeat it. That is what everybody's like COD response is. Which that does hold some water, obviously. Like we've been talking throughout this conversation, like what we are witnessing, unfold in 2018 is the same thing we watched unfold in the 80s. It's the same thing we watched unfold in the 30s. Like we've seen how this game ends. We've seen how this play, we know what the third act looks like. And so historians, we just pull our hair like, why are we doing this again? I think the Trump administration draws a lot of comparisons to the Third Reich, and in some ways, I think that's a fair comparison, but in a lot of ways, I don't think it's fair at all. I think it's vastly too extreme, and it turns people off. You compare Hitler or Trump to Hitler, and it becomes the person's just not going to talk to you anymore. However, I think the comparisons are useful to Thatcherism and Reaganism for sure. And you sort of teased me about liking comic books. Like Alan Moore wrote V for Vendetta in the 80s, which was about a fascist takeover, because of Thatcherism. Like he was watching Margaret Thatcher in the 80s, and her policies and her sort of iron-fisted police state, and he sort of imagined it out. So what history gives us is first a playbook, a script that we can say, like, look, this is all a play, and we've seen this play to its conclusion already. Like, maybe we could do something different. That is one function of history. But
if we endlessly repeat it, is the potential use of history just not being used?
Yes. Yeah, I think, I think so. Like, that's why I think, that answer that we have to study history so we're not doomed to repeat it, whatever, that old, trite aphorism, I can't even remember who was supposed to have first said it. That's only useful to a point, to a degree, because it also assumes that we are perpetually on an arc of progress, which I don't think we are. I think history tends to be more cyclical than progressive, which was, part of my criticism of my last game on the list, which, we might come back to, we might not. But I think that when we study history, what history actually provides, analysis of history, is, a useful toolkit to analyze and critique society based on, the same way that a sociologist does or philosopher does. But our data is, the past as opposed to the present. But it is a useful device to critique patterns in society. History gives us an ability to understand, feminism and why, women still play a role, a secondary role, and why there is a gender pay gap, and how patriarchy works. History gives us a tool, to understand, like, the arc of how racism continues to be instantiated and perpetuated. That's what history does. We're not just trying to avoid past mistakes. We're trying to use the past in order to understand and critique the present and how we got here. But it's not going to provide any answers for then what to do next. That's like Isaac Asimov shit, man. Like, that's what he was about. But that's not what history's for.
So, your last game, I might be giving away my prejudices here a bit, but the first question I've written on this sheet of notes is this the best board game ever made?
Right. And I saw that in your show notes, and my response is a very hard yes.
The more I play this game, the more I'm convinced of its genius and that it transcends pretty much anything I've ever played.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could it's Through the Ages. If anybody...
Oh yeah, I should have mentioned the name of the game.
Right. It's fine. Well, they should be, when I said it's the greatest game ever made, they should have just been able to know, that obviously we were talking about Ready, Set, Spaghetti. Yeah, the people who are listening to this, I'm gonna go ahead and assume were Perfect Information listeners as well. So or at least for the cross section, that listen to both shows, I have to know at this point that it is my favorite game, of all time. I'm relatively new to it though, to be honest. Like I probably have only been playing Through the Ages for about 18 months or so. That was the first time I ever picked it up. And I actually played online before I ever got a copy to the table once I had learned it. But there's absolutely no way this would not be the first game I grabbed. Because I think it is, it's not only my favorite game, but I would go, I hate having these stupid arguments because a lot of it's just sort of what do your tastes imply. But, I really do think it is the finest piece of game design, that we know up to this date.
What does it do so well? Why could you make that statement about it?
I think what it does well, and this is funny because it goes back to what I was just saying about history. It progresses in an arc in a way that I don't think I've ever played a game that does. You start with relatively nothing. And then you watch your civilization progress and expand. And the way the mechanics work in the game, it is to your benefit to at some point specialize your society, your civilization. You can't do everything in the game because there just isn't enough time and there certainly isn't enough actions allowed. So, you want to get your resources and your science going so you can actually develop and build more things. But at some point you have to decide, am I going to start building temples and religion or am I going to start building theaters? Am I going to focus on my military? And then as the next wave of cards come out, it's to your benefit to focus on what you've already created rather than to try to start something new. So if you've already got, a theater down, then it makes more sense in Age 2 to advance the theater to the next level as opposed to like scrapping like the theater and starting with your libraries or your, arenas or whatever. And then it's, at some point it becomes like you need to have Shakespeare as your leader and then Charlie Chaplin or whatever. However it works, whatever your society becomes about in your particular game, you can watch it unfold in a way that's both natural and sensible. Like you understand why, by the time you get to Age 3 and the game's over or Age 4 and the game's over, you understand exactly why your society looks the way it does. And you can almost tell a precise story of how you got from beginning to end. That we were doing that on Twitter for a while. We were playing the game online and we were like live tweeting what we were doing and naming our societies and stuff like that. And it was fun, but we were also telling the story of how we were advancing. And that story always makes sense. If you play it well, if you just like flounder and people you draw bad cards, like you can really get your ass kicked in Through the Ages, in a hurry. But if you play the game well, that story always makes sense by the end of the game. And I think it's phenomenal. Like I don't particularly like storytelling games, because I don't actually want the game to tell me the story. I want to be able to tell the story of the game I'm playing on my own. And there's a couple games that do that really well. Pandemic, I think, is one, but I don't think any game does that better than Through the Ages. Gives you a full experience of something having happened from beginning to end, in a way that, feels almost narrative, even though there's no narrative in the actual mechanics of the game.
Okay. So last question. You're heading up to the cabin. You're speeding along the country path. You fire around a corner and the back door of the car flies open. 4 of the games fly out down a ravine into a river and are swept away. Which is the game that you hope is lying on the back seat?
Through the Ages. Yeah. I think that's my answer. It's a tragedy. Just like the entire scenario here is a tragedy. Just watching all of your favorite things go up in smoke or down the ravine or whatever, however the story ends. But I think I would hope at least Through the Ages remains. It's my favorite game. It is the thing I feel most attached to. It's certainly, if I had to just continue to get rid of my entire collection, it would be the last game standing at the end of the day. But also that sense of like my, duty as an archivist to the hobby, like wanting to maintain this part of our culture. So when, the aliens finally land and they find the rubble of what used to exist as us, like this is what they would hold up as the thing that we thought board gaming was. I would want Through the Ages to be the answer to that question. And so that is the one I would maintain longer than anything else.
So if people want to know what you're up to or get hold of you, how would they do that?
I'm on Twitter, at The Good Mariner. And I also run a Twitter handle called I Call Yellow. That was attached to a blog that I was doing for a while, but I wasn't really getting, I wasn't feeling like I was getting any traction on what I wanted it to be about. And I also just wasn't getting enough sort of response and interaction. So now that's mostly just a Twitter handle where I post all my board game stuff. But my personal Twitter is also at The Good Mariner.
Nick Mariner, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was great. I had a lot of fun.
And if you want to suggest a guest, or if you want to say something nice about the show, or if you want to say something horrible about the show, you can contact me on @5gamesfordoomsday on Twitter, or you can send me an email at 5gamesfordoomsday@gmail.com. You can visit the website, 5gamesfordoomsday.com, or you can go to the BGG Guild. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/5G4D. And if I haven't had to don my skeletos and jog to my lead-lined bungalow of survival to escape the toxic candy floss and the feces-flinging monkeys, I'll see you in 2 weeks for another 5 Games for Doomsday.